Friday. I want to just introduce our guest ethics lecturer for today. Professor Chris Cuomo is a political philosopher and ethicist and a practical philosopher who has been working on environmental ethics and social justice issues for her entire career. She's written and edited a variety of types of projects, including 4 books that are written or edited. She writes popular pieces as well as many philosophical articles, and she's won a ton of grants from the Rockefeller Foundation and the National Science Foundation. And as I said, this Wednesday, Professor Cuomo is somebody who has been doing participatory research in the vein of an environmental justice, participatory justice kind of notion. So I hope you will join me in welcoming Professor Cuomo to Princeton.
Good morning. I thank you so much to Lori and Blake and Rob and Steve and everyone who invited me to come lecture here. I am really delighted. I was going to brag about bringing the great weather from Georgia. Yesterday I was like, I did it, and then, well, you know, April showers bring May flowers, so. It's warming. Well, we want warming. Do we want warming? When you're giving a talk about climate change, I guess you don't want to get too enthusiastic about all forms of warming. Also, it was a class like this, an undergraduate interdisciplinary environmental studies class that I took my very last semester of undergraduate year, of my undergraduate studies, that I first learned about global warming, you know, so like Al Gore, for that one undergraduate lecture was really powerful. So I hope that, I looked at your syllabus and looked at a lot of the slide shows, presentations, and wow, you guys have learned a lot in here, and the nexus of bringing it all together, I'm sure is going to be really interesting for your final exam or whatever it is that you're going to do. Okay, so let's get right into it. I'm here to talk to you today about research that I have done with an interdisciplinary group, with a group of scientists, physical geographers primarily, on the North Slope of Alaska. And I'm here, another philosopher, kind of under the banner of ethics, but I really think of this more as a project in, or also a project in epistemology, participatory science, and climate change science, and how we can do that. So we are going to go to the North Slope of Alaska, the Alaskan coastal plain, which is kind of the upper third of Alaska up here. It's very, very kind of barren. It's 300 miles above the Arctic Circle. So there's, it's a lot like a moonscape, as you'll see in a minute. Do you have anyone in the room from Alaska? Or anyone who's been to northern Alaska? Did you go to Barrow or fly to Barrow?
No, I raised my hand before you qualified northern. I was living in like just below Denali for a bit.
Okay. Yeah, that's like the balmy south, right? compared to Barrow. Yeah, but great. And so you know a bit about what a diverse landscape Alaska is. So this is the landscape of the coastal plain is very unique. It is permafrost, and it is covered by thaw lakes. And so you see these blue lakes. This is a satellite image taken in the spring. And so the blue lakes are kind of live lakes that have water in them. They're pretty shallow lakes. They form kind of gradually when the tundra slumps in an area and the water collects, and then they eventually drain. But this is all over geological time in the course of kind of up to about 1,000 years. But understanding this process is very important for understanding permafrost and how the permafrost is going to respond to climate change and global warming. So let's start with our first clicker question, and this is my first clicker question ever. So what do I have to do? Okay.
Here, I'll teach you. This is funny.
Okay.
So I'm probably not supposed to do this, given what I know. Okay, so we start in the hole.
Okay. So you all see the question. So permafrost is relevant in relation to climate change. It's important because if it melts, it will A, increase sea levels, B, emit carbon into the atmosphere, C, disintegrate and float away, 4, D, result in severe erosion.
I hit A again. Yes? And then hit B.
Ah, fantastic. Yes. Okay. Nobody voted for C. Yeah, good. I tried to make one of those. Well, let's see. So, yeah, so if you answered B, you were right. Oh, wait, no, what's happening? It's not. Try to do something.
Do I need to remove this? Okay. Okay.
What's happening? So 4, result in severe erosion is also a right answer. Right, so, and that is part of what I'm going to be showing you and talking about today. So yes, and why does permafrost emit carbon into the atmosphere?
Because the carbon is trapped in the permafrost. So
Yes, so it's very carbon-rich soil. It's peat. And so when permafrost melts, that carbon is emitted. Good news is that the scientists that I work with who study the permafrost are finding that it is not that the carbon is not emitting from the permafrost as quickly as was anticipated. It's one of the few things that in climate science is actually kind of moving slower than science had anticipated. So that's sort of good news. Okay, so understanding this landscape is very important for understanding what's going to go on with this particularly vulnerable landscape, the permafrost, the tundra, but this is also an issue of climate justice. So this is not just a vulnerable landscape or a vulnerable kind of ecosystem. It's also a landscape where a unique community has lived for, they would say, millennia. It's a subsistence community whose livelihood depends on the health of this landscape. Just a few more shots of the thaw lake process. So there's a former thaw lake bed, the green, and then you can see these polygons that form in the frozen tundra. So it's just a really, really fascinating landscape to study for those who are interested in geology. Oh gosh, and what's this? What's this animal that lives in the North Slope? So this is a very petroleum-rich landscape, and so that kind of creates other significant vulnerabilities both for the land and for the community. So here are the folks that I work with. These are physical geographers who study the thaw lake process primarily by taking core samples of lake beds, former lake beds. And in those core samples, there's a geological history of the landscape that includes pollen. As some of you may know, pollen lasts forever. And so you can look at that core sample just like you look at the rings of a tree to kind of learn things about its life cycle. You can look at this core sample and see what pollen is present from different time scales And that pollen tells you how warm the environment was and what was growing. So several years ago, and here's a view of Barrow from the main city in the North Slope from above. You can see in the background those the thaw waves. So this is the Arctic Sea. So the Beaufort Sea. So if you hear things about drill baby drill in the Beaufort Sea, they're talking about like right out here. And this is where the local indigenous community does their whaling. So the whales come past in the spring and the fall, and the local community harvests the whales. They're one of the few communities that's allowed to harvest whales under the guidelines of the International Whaling Commission, because it's a subsistence practice and they only do it using traditional methods. There's a lovely picture of spring in the Arctic, so you might call it a bit of a mudscape. And let's go on to our second clicker question. Just kind of curious about your familiarity with the names of indigenous folks in northern Alaska. These are, of course, our fellow Americans. So, what's the name for the indigenous people of northernmost Alaska? Inuit, Eskimo, Inupiaq, Lenni Lenape. Ah, fantastic. Okay, good. So this is not exactly a trick question. So Inuit isn't wrong, but Inuit is kind of like the umbrella name, like European. Okay, so Inupiaq people of northernmost Alaska, that's the name, Inupiaq. And Inupiaq people are relatives of the Inuit of Canada, and also the Kalalit of Greenland, but their name is Inupiaq. And if there's one thing that you remember from today's lecture, I would just be delighted if you would kind of remember that. Eskimo is considered derogatory, and in fact the Obama administration eliminated Eskimo from all federal documents. It's sort of like the N-word, although you will hear some Inupiaq elders use the term, and it's used to kind of name desserts like Eskimo ice cream and stuff like that. So you just got to be careful how and when you use it. Here is how folks get around in the neighborhood in northernmost Alaska. And as I said, this is a whaling community. And so the environmental conditions, the reliability of the ice cover, the timing of the ice, the timing of when the whales come through, etc., are absolutely fundamental to their well-being, sense of self, and of course their nutrition, their food. This is muktuk, which is the folks' favorite part of the whale. It's the outer skin, that black is the outer skin of the whale, and then the pink is the fat right below the skin. And you cut it up like that with your ulu, that's a traditional knife, and eat it like sushi. Unless you're a vegan. But you might be a vegan researcher who respects the Inupiaq, and so when they offer you some muktuk, you try it. This is Flossie Itta. She has passed away, but she was the local person who motivated this collaborative research. Those physical geographers, the scientists who I showed you a moment ago, were working, doing their core samples up in northern Alaska about 12 years ago, and one of them got sick, and so she was hanging out at the science station in Barrow. There's a huge science station where a lot of international research is done on the ice, on the tundra, on Arctic species. And Wendy was hanging out at the science station. She wasn't feeling well, and the science station is on Inupiaq land, and a lot of local Inupiaq folks work in the science station. And not surprisingly maybe, for reasons that are all about oppression. They tend to not be the scientists, but they are technicians, etc. And a guy who worked on the snow machines said to Wendy, "Hey, I heard you guys are studying the lakes. You know, the old folks know about the lakes." And Wendy was like, "Oh, yeah, okay." So she started doing some pilot interviews with local elders to ask them what they know about the lakes, and especially what they know about the lakes in the epistemological gap of science. So we have 50 years of satellite imagery, and then we can get core samples that tell us, that have kind of good information from, like, 500 years ago on back, but the gap of kind of, recent history, is sort of like the last 200 years of the history of the permafrost in the North Slope, is the gap in the scientific knowledge, and that's precisely what the elders know about and can tell us about. And as it turns out, the elders are super interested in talking to the scientists. So you don't want to do collaborative research. Collaborative research is collaborative from the bottom up, right? So you don't go in and say to folks, "We're going to do this research, and you want to collaborate, with us, and here's what the research is, and here's your role," right? If it's really collaborative, it should be deeply collaborative. So we went to the community and said that we wanted to kind of integrate their local knowledge into the research, because the scientists really wanted to know what the elders' experiences of the thaw lakes are, and what their understanding of the thaw lake drainage processes and the development processes. And as it turns out, the local folks really wanted to know what the scientists were learning. Obviously, this is their homeland, and even 12 years ago, folks, of course, knew that their homeland is, ground zero for climate change. So we got an incredible amount of buy-in from the elders across the North Slope, and for 10 years did interviews with elders in the 7 villages, including a village in the mountains, Anatuvik Pass. This is Tommy Brower and Virginia Brower. And Tommy, for example, told us about a lake that he witnessed the draining of the lake. And he said, it drained like faster than anything. He was putting out his net to fish, and then suddenly, for no apparent reason, the lake drained into the river. And so the physical geographers were like, "That's shocking that the lake could drain quickly and catastrophically like that." And we were able to confirm it through the satellite imagery. So the process of putting the elder knowledge in conversation with the scientific knowledge includes ground truthing things with, what we think of as scientific methods, but the local community's questions can also guide the research. So in the research, we learned that that the local community was really concerned about how much damage their snow machines are doing to the tundra. And there was so people leave the town of Barrow and go out to their hunting cabins, and there was sort of like a snowmobile superhighway was formed over the tundra, and you saw what springtime is like in the Arctic, and so that creates like this big mud pathway, and their concern, right, so the scientists were like, "Oh, damage to the tundra, that's terrible." Their concern was that it was going to change the paths that the caribou take, right? The caribou weren't crossing the snow machine superhighway. And so with the help of scientists and the local borough, we worked to bring this special kind of netting to the snowmobile superhighway so that so there's not further damage, and that seems to be working with the caribou migrations. This is Arnold Brower Sr. Arnold he has also passed away. So everyone who you've seen thus far, except for Virginia, has passed away, which is one of the really heartbreaking things about working with elders. It's one reason why we got immediate NSF funding when we proposed this project, because there's an obvious urgency to working with the elders. There's also extraordinarily high rates of cancer in this community. Can anyone guess why? Folks who eat whale? Massive amounts of carcinogens. So the carcinogens bioaccumulate in sea mammals. So folks who eat sea mammals, especially their fat, are eating massive amounts of carcinogens. This was discovered because there was some researchers in Toronto wanted to do a study of the of breast milk for Canadian women, and so they had these kind of fears that there were a lot of toxins in breast milk, and they needed a really clean control sample. So they said, well, let's get a control sample of breast milk from like the cleanest place. And so they got samples of women's breast milk from northern Alaska. And when they tested it, it had toxin levels that were off the charts. And so they decided that their equipment must be broken, because it was like impossible that these women who live so far away from industrial development could have this much carcinogen in their breast milk. And retested and retested, got more samples, and then figured out that it was because of this bioaccumulation of carcinogens. I have an even sadder story about Arnold Brower. So Arnold Brower is sort of like a patriarch of the North Slope. His father, he was the last surviving son of Charles Brower, who was the American whaler who founded the city of Barrow. Three guys on a whaling ship decided to, they were doing trading in Barrow, and they realized that they could make a nice living setting up a trading post, and that was how the city of Barrow was kind of formalized. So there's a really cool book about that called 50 Years Below Zero, about the life of Charles Brower. So Arnold he married an Inupiaq woman, and they had like 14 or 15 kids. So Arnold was the last remaining surviving son, and we did extensive interviews with Arnold, and folks are really well educated, really savvy. Arnold when he was 18, his father said, well, you can either go to Berkeley like your older sister, you can go down south and go to Berkeley, or you can be the reindeer herder. You can kind of control the herd that kind of roams this huge expanse outside of Barrow. And so Arnold chose to be a reindeer herder. So he walked the entire North Slope, and he just knew every crevice, and he was also very interested in and very invested in hearing what the scientific team knew and was learning about the tundra. So, I mean, this is somebody who's like an expert, and even at the age of 70, Arnold would go out hunting on his snow machine, and he would go out hunting alone. And it was November of 2012 that Arnold went out hunting in November, as he always did, and a stream that looked frozen and that was always frozen in November wasn't frozen that year, and his snow machine went into the stream, and he managed to pull himself out of the stream, which is amazing enough, but he didn't survive. So this amazing elder with this incredible knowledge, local knowledge, and commitment to sharing that knowledge was, I but you know, I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that he was a victim of climate change. So it's really important when doing this work not only to be collaborative from the bottom up, but also to share the knowledge. Then the question, like, what are the best ways to share the knowledge? So part of our whole model, and the community really liked this because, as I said, they're really very tech savvy. We created a geographic information system, a GIS, that geolocates everything that the elders told us about landscape change. And so this is really helpful to the North Slope Borough. And we also, every year we did a workshop where we presented our data, presented our findings, and talked to the local community about kind of, you know, what they thought about the findings and, you know, what was useful to them and what they might like us to ask about further. So, you know, there are, in any kind of project, you know, one reason why I wanted to come talk to you about this is because I think it's it's our model of interdisciplinarity, right? I'm a philosopher. These are physical geographers. We come to the work with different kinds of questions. So that collaboration is kind of interesting and at times complicated. So I would get, as a philosopher, I would get curious about questions that some of the scientists on the team would be like, well, who cares about that? Like so I would love hearing about the local cosmology, you know, and how people thought about kind of their position in relation to the universe, and you know, and some of the geographers would be like, why are you even asking that? And like, what? You know, so there needs to be a lot of dialogue about the interdisciplinary process, but we learn so much in that process, and I think all develop as researchers and as human beings. But then it's also important to experiment with different ways of sharing, not only sharing the information with the community, but also creating a collaborative process. So it's not just a one-dimensional sharing, but you're also kind of asking questions and then either adjusting, modifying, or developing the research accordingly. So I want to show you some video now, and this is 7 minutes long, okay? So 7 whole minutes of watching. But I think that you'll find it compelling. So these are just clips from our interviews, just to give a sense of who these folks are, what this local community is, what their concerns are, and also what our process is in the collaborative research. Now, let me just say one thing, that I think I used the word vulnerable already, right? I usually kind of put it in scare quotes. So the tundra is vulnerable, right? Under the conditions of global warming, because it's frozen, right? So something that's frozen and that's supposed to be frozen is vulnerable when things get too warm. Different communities are also labeled vulnerable communities. And they might be vulnerable just because they own condos on the seaside, right? But they might also be vulnerable because history has made them vulnerable through, you know, unequal economic policies, or bad education, or colonialism, or oppression, or genocide. So it's important to recognize and interact with or be part of vulnerable communities, and to acknowledge that vulnerability. But we also don't want to reduce communities. We don't want to be reduced to our vulnerabilities. And that's what this whole project is about, empowering the local knowledge and conceiving of the local community as a community with extremely valuable resources, with a lot of power, with a lot of cultural strength, with valid needs, with their own opinions about what they want to happen in their local community in the face of climate change, etc. So I've written about this, and I always kind of want to put this idea of vulnerability in scare quotes. It's important to notice that certain communities are more subject to disproportional impacts of climate change, but we don't want to reduce them to their vulnerability. And I think that really listening, instead of kind of just kind of thinking of these communities in the abstract, I think that listening helps to not reduce those to their vulnerability.
Always traveling, hunting with our parents is how we're actually taught, and they talk up the land, and our grandparents talk up all the lands and where they've been, all the way up to the mountains, past beyond the mountains, or into Canada, go down Scottsdale. And when I do travel, listening to them stories so good, and I recognize those lands. Just from what they talk about, I remember.
That's the landscape. These structures that you'll see are hunting cabins. And this is the Whaling Festival, where folks are distributing the whale, celebrating and distributing the whale. And that's the blanket toss.
This is what the North Slope looked like last year. And we also have something like this from 1975, so 30 years ago. And so we can look at lakes that existed in 1975 and now they're gone. So they've drained.
There's one right here.
Yeah.
It's gone
Okay.
right close to the mouth where they used to get water from when that old building was there.
So we don't have these sorts of satellite images before 1975. So we have to ask people, do you remember where there were lakes, but now they're gone?
And there's a lot of big holes, and right by the river, and so much road, and it's because of warming, like global warming, like glaciers. A lot of glaciers around, but they always melt in summertime. We call it glaciers that don't melt, but they all melt, even this one down there, right in that took up in the air, all over by the mountains. They stay there for a while, but some have a little bit of ice left, if it's warm to warm.
There's been a lot of changes, like the water temperature, and it doesn't freeze early like it used to. But we used to come over here almost every other year to ice fish, and it's getting harder and harder to go up there because the weather gets so dangerous.
What do you mean by dangerous?
It gets windy right off the bat.
What about?
That's a long way to go. Golly knows.
Yeah.
It's when it used to freeze early, we'd go up there, but not anymore.
Because now it's.
No, it's within the last 20 years. Our camp has changed so much. There's so much growth.
From between chip 2 and chip 1, the river used to come out in a different route, but now it comes right through the lakes. These are what we call the dry lakes now.
Oh.
Because they're drained, because the river goes right through them now.
Right there.
Yeah, right at those lakes, so they're drained
I see
too. But the river goes right through them, and
half a mile from the cabin, there used to be a nice, real big lake. That's gone. You could tell it's erosion where it breaks apart the tundra and it drains into the river.
Mhm.
Why that happens, but you see them, you can tell where there used to be a lake and they're gone now.
Mhm.
Are there any issues with your cabin, the location of your cabin in the river?
Yeah, I have to move mine.
6 years ago, there was a beaver here. One of my grandsons got it right in the river. Beaver appeared, he got it and I had to skin it. And we don't know how to eat the beavers. Because we have no leader, the healthy, that's just from Helena, Indian area. She told us what to do.
How do you
Cook it.
Is it up?
I think they stick on other ways, but easiest way is boil it.
Uh-huh. How was it?
We never really did that before, but we ate some. We don't yum yum.
Yeah.
It was strange food for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I try not to go very far on account of I guess my machine might break down way out there.
Mhm. Then you're stuck.
Thank you.
So you see the centrality of the celebrating and sharing of traditional foods in the culture and in the very conception of what it means to be a Nupiaq. So in that, so the team that catches the whale, the whaling crew, distributes and shares the whale throughout the whole community, and it goes all the way across Alaska. So people will fly down to Anchorage to make sure that people get their box of muktuk and whatnot, and then people will share the muktuk and the caribou. So there's a lot of sharing of the sea animals, the folks who focus on harvesting sea animals and the folks who focus on harvesting land animals exchange and share those. And then that dance at the end is they call it Eskimo dancing, so there, you can call that Eskimo dancing. And it's the dance that the women traditionally do to invite the whale to come to them. So the belief among the Inupiaq is that the whale comes to the Inupiaq and gives itself to the Inupiaq by virtue of the whaling captain's wife inviting the whale. So the women do this dance to invite the whale. That motivates the whale, inspires the whale to give itself. Although women also participate in the spearing and going out into the boat and kind of killing the whale and harvesting the whale. And women are the main ones who cut up the whale. This is interesting information because in an anthropology class, you may learn that Inuit, and now you'll be like, do you really mean Inupiaq? The Inuit people are the classical, they're the iconic hunter-gatherer society. Because when Europeans had contact, they just saw the men going out and killing these great big sea mammals, and the women were at home, and so they are classified throughout the anthropological literature as masculine hunter, feminine gatherer. The gathering is berries. So for 1 month in the summer, in August, that tundra kind of turns into fields of berries. It's really amazing and beautiful and very colorful, but it's all kind of very small. What the Inupiaq say is that everyone is a hunter because there was a gender division of labor, but the women made the clothing. So they make the whalers' clothing out of seal skins and whale intestines and sinew, which is waterproof. And you couldn't hunt whales in the Arctic without that kind of clothing. And so the Inupiaq themselves describe whaling and the hunting as communal, and don't characterize it as something like that just the men do. So they acknowledge, they prioritize the fact that everyone might have, kind of a unique role, but that all of those roles are equally crucial. So just to sum up, and then I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions in case you have any questions about the video, especially. So what kind of science, what kind of research do vulnerable and highly impacted communities and landscapes need? And that might be in northern Alaska, that might be at the Jersey Shore, that might be in Ghana, right? That might be in Oman, in regions that are disproportionately affected by drought. Well, what they need is their local knowledge. And that might also include indigenous knowledge, long-term local knowledge for communities that are fundamentally connected to these specific places. Right? The Inupiaq could not do what the Inupiaq do as Inupiaq anywhere else. And so they are very, very connected to this very specific and embattled landscape. They also need community-driven questions. And so science has the opportunity to elicit and collaborate in terms of community-driven questions, as well as the questions that are developed in the abstract or kind of far away from the specific location. Vulnerable communities also need science that is participatory and empowering. Right? And they need to be doing the science, and they need for their kids to be trained in the technologies that are going to generate scientific knowledge that's relevant for their communities. I think we all need collaborative methods across the disciplines and also between scientists and communities. That might also mean that scientists who live in communities in more developed locations can get involved with generating locally relevant science in their own context. And finally, we need ongoing commitments and conversations among diverse forms of inquiry, technology, and expertise. So a big part of this project, and one reason why I was so happy to get involved in it, is that these are scientists who have been working on the North Slope for decades and are really kind of committed to the place and have a long-term relationship with the place, so we can continue to ask these questions and see how these questions and needs and research, see how they develop as other phenomena like global warming and climate change develop, and also as politics develop, right? Because if you have a politician who is screaming "drill baby drill" in your backyard, then that has an effect on your local situation. Any questions or comments? Any questions about the video or? Yes.
So I was just really interested in the idea of the oral environmental history. But I was wondering with some of the experiences that the communities had before, and like also hearing politicians say like drill baby drill, was there any like skepticism when you came and started like asking these questions?
Yeah, great question. And I had with other projects that I've done, say in Australia, there's usually a lot of, indigenous people have every reason to be like, scientists, see ya, right, go away because of histories of harm, and there's some really harrowing histories in the North Slope. For example, there was a project to, when the politics of disarmament started to develop in the 60s, the US military was like, well, what are we going to do with all these nuclear arms? Oh, well, let's use them for engineering projects. So we could, where could we use a nuclear bomb for an engineering project? Well, in Alaska, we could set off a nuclear bomb and create a canal in the middle of nowhere, right? So there's a great version of that story in a book called The Firecracker Boys. But we got an amazing amount of buy-in, as I said, I think because folks, given global warming and climate change, even before folks were using those words up there, they knew that it would be beneficial for them to learn more about what the scientists are doing up there. And this is a community that really values their elder knowledge. Right, there's a reason that the guy who works on snowmobiles said, talk to the old folks, right? Because everyone knows that the old folks have knowledge. They know Inupiaq place names. So their descriptions might be, are often in Inupiaq. We always have a translator, even though people speak English. They speak English because they were not. This is the generation that was not allowed to speak their language when they were taken to boarding schools in California in the 50s. But there's just a global sense that the elder knowledge is incredibly precious and valuable. And so the elders were very excited about the idea of having their knowledge videotaped and archived. So it's a great question, and we were really lucky. And that's what makes it a valuable collaboration too, because you don't want to be working with folks who aren't like truly into the collaboration. That's just sort of neo-colonial, or it risks being neo-colonial. Anything else? Yes.
I'm really struck by how vulnerable this community is to things that are happening outside of this community, and you seem to be in this list talking about scientists who are working on a local level, on research locally, but yes. I'm wondering about the impact of having these communities be able to talk to people studying global change on scales that are global rather than local. Really good point. There's a lot of, so there's a very politically robust and well-resourced interpolar council, circumpolar council, and so members of the community are very involved in geopolitics around climate change and whaling, etc. And so I think that they have access there. Although then we kind of come to find out, so we do a lot of talks in the schools, and there's like very little science at the elementary level in that community. So there's not very good scientific literacy. So we also kind of took on or kind of integrated some work in this project. So we asked, like, are there ways that we can help to increase scientific literacy? So there's, I think that maybe there should be a little bit more curiosity, and every year people kind of get more interested and savvy in things at the geopolitical level. But because the local situation is so intense, I think that that's kind of just where the obsession is. Also, many local folks work for the petroleum industry, right? So the local jobs are either you work for the tribe, right? So you work for the community, or you go work on the oil fields, which are just one short plane ride away. And so that is also a complicating factor. And that's one reason why 12 years ago we weren't even hearing global warming up there. And Alaska's a very red state. And folks, it's really interesting because folks in the interviews talk about Republicans, or how much they love their Republican representatives or whatever, and then when you see how they vote, it's totally blue up here. So there's a lot of other kind of questions to ask in that context. Yeah. All right, thank you very much for your time.